On a quiet autumn morning in Columbus, Ohio, a moving truck rolled slowly down the brick-lined streets of Maplewood. For David Johnson, a 42-year-old software engineer, this wasn't just another address. It was supposed to be his sanctuary, the place where he could plant flowers, sip coffee on the porch, and finally feel at home. But before the first box touched the porch, eyes were already watching from behind curtains. Some curious, some cautious, and one pair sharp, calculating that belonged to Margaret Whitmore, the longtime president of the neighborhood HOA. To her, David wasn't a neighbor. He was a disruption. A man she hadn't welcomed, didn't trust, and had no intention of accepting. And with one clipped sentence, "Are you even aware of our HOA guidelines?" the peace David had dreamed of shattered. This story is not only about property lines and rules. It's about what happens when prejudice dresses itself up as authority, and when one man decides that silence is no longer an option. Because sometimes, the real battle for justice begins not in courtrooms or headlines, but right on your front lawn. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and the faint echo of a moving truck grinding its gears down Maplewood Lane. For most people, it was just another Saturday morning in Columbus, Ohio. But for David Johnson, it was the beginning of a dream he had carried for years, a dream of peace, stability, and finally owning a home where his children could one day visit and feel proud of the man who built a life on his own terms. David was 42, tall, steady in his movements, with the calm focus of someone who had learned to endure storms without showing how much they hurt. As a software engineer, he had spent long nights coding in silence, earning every dollar with the belief that if he worked hard enough, he would carve out a place where no one could question his belonging. Today, standing on the porch of the house he had just purchased with cash, he thought that dream had arrived. He placed the first box of books by the door and paused to take in the quiet. But quiet has a way of being deceptive. Behind lace curtains and blinds that shifted just slightly, eyes were watching. Some curious, some indifferent, but one pair was sharper than the rest, cold, critical, unwelcoming. Those eyes belonged to Margaret Whitmore, president of the neighborhood HOA. Margaret was in her late 50s, with hair pulled tightly into a bun and a reputation that stretched beyond the cul-de-sac. Her heels made a staccato rhythm on the sidewalk whenever she walked, a sound that neighbors often joked was the warning bell of Maplewood's queen. To Margaret, the neighborhood was more than streets and homes. It was her kingdom, and to her, David Johnson was an intruder. She had already written a story in her mind. He must be a renter, someone who would chip away at the carefully curated image of perfection she believed she maintained. She folded her arms across her chest and studied him like an officer inspecting a suspect. David didn't notice her at first. He was focused on unloading the next box, a set of framed photos wrapped carefully in newspaper. His parents on their wedding day, his late grandmother's smile, the woman who told him stories of resilience and faith. His own college graduation, a moment that once seemed impossible. These pictures weren't just decorations, they were proof of survival, of dignity, of a history that mattered. As he set the box down, he finally felt that stare, sharp enough to pierce through the morning calm. He turned slowly and saw her. A woman standing at the edge of the driveway, posture rigid, eyes hidden behind sunglasses that reflected his own image back at him. He gave a small, polite nod. "Good morning," he said, his voice warm but cautious. Margaret didn't return the greeting. Instead, her words cut the air like glass. "Are you even aware of our HOA guidelines?" It wasn't a question. It was an accusation dressed as civility. David blinked, taken aback. "Guidelines?" he asked, balancing the frame in his hand. "I just moved in yesterday." Margaret tilted her head slightly, as if confirming her own suspicions. "Moved in? As in renting?" "Because tenants aren't permitted on Maplewood Lane. It's in the bylaws. This is a community of homeowners." Her voice carried across the street, loud enough for blinds to twitch and neighbors to lean closer to their windows. David felt his jaw tighten, but he forced a smile. "No, I'm not renting," he said calmly. "I live here now. This is my home." But Margaret wasn't satisfied. She stepped closer, her heels striking louder now, as if they carried the weight of authority itself. "We'll see about that," she muttered. "I'll need proof. A copy of the lease, or better yet, the deed. Until then, you're in violation." The word violation hit David harder than he expected, not because he doubted his ownership, but because of the way she said it, like he was guilty before proven innocent, like his very presence was a crime. He had lived through this kind of subtle prejudice before, the assumption that he didn't belong, that he was less, that he needed to justify his existence. But here it was again, right at the doorstep of the home he thought would finally be free from those shadows. He exhaled slowly, setting the frame down on the porch rail. "I don't see how this is your concern," he said evenly. "I'm just unpacking." But Margaret's lips curled into something between a smirk and a warning. "It is my concern. I'm the president of the HOA. It's my responsibility to maintain the integrity of this neighborhood. People here take pride in ownership." Ownership. The irony almost made David laugh. He had wired hundreds of thousands of dollars to buy this home, signed every line of the contract, shook hands with the realtor, and carried his dreams into these walls. Yet here he was, being told by a stranger that he hadn't earned the right to exist here. The neighbors were still watching. He could feel them. Some pretending to water their lawns longer than usual, others pausing mid-walk with their dogs. To them, this wasn't just an introduction. It was entertainment, a performance. David thought of what his grandmother used to say, "Not every battle is worth your breath, but some silences carry more power than shouts." He smiled faintly, picked up his box again, and carried it inside, leaving Margaret standing on the sidewalk, heels clicking against the concrete like the echo of control. But the confrontation wasn't over. The next morning, taped neatly to his freshly painted front door, was a notice. Bold letters at the top read, "Notice of HOA violation." Beneath it, Margaret's handwriting demanded proof of residency within 72 hours, removal of moving boxes from the porch, and documentation of ownership or tenancy. David stood there holding a cup of coffee, reading the paper twice, deciding whether to laugh or feel insulted. He had the deed sitting safely in his drawer, stamped by the county recorder's office. Yet here he was, being treated like a trespasser in his own home. He folded the notice slowly and whispered to himself, "So this is how we're doing things." From across the street came the clearing of a throat. Margaret was there again, arms crossed, as if she had been waiting for this very moment. "Good morning," she said flatly. David raised his mug, unfazed. "Morning. I see you received the notice," she continued, nodding toward the folded paper in his hand. "Yes," David replied, sipping calmly. "I read it." "And?" she pressed. "And," David said, setting the cup down on the porch rail, "I don't see how it applies to me." The tension hung heavy between them as neighbors shifted curtains and a man across the street turned off his garden hose, pretending not to watch. Margaret's eyes narrowed. "It applies to everyone. If you're renting, that's a violation. If you're improperly storing items on your porch, that's a violation. The HOA has rules for a reason." David straightened, his patience thinning. "Let's clear something up," he said firmly. "I'm not renting. And those boxes? That's called moving in. It's called life." His voice carried farther than he intended, but he didn't care. He wanted them all to hear. Margaret's lips tightened. "Then provide documentation. If you're truly the owner, that shouldn't be difficult. Otherwise, you'll be fined." David laughed, not in humor but in disbelief. "Fined? For living in my own house?" "Correct," she snapped. And there it was, the spark of confrontation that would set the entire street ablaze. David looked her straight in the eye, and with a steady calmness that unsettled her more than anger ever could, he said, "You want proof? Fine, I'll show you proof. But when I do, I expect an apology." Margaret scoffed, her pride unwilling to bend. "Don't hold your breath." David's expression didn't waver. "Oh, I won't," he said, "because unlike you, I don't go around making assumptions about strangers." For the first time, words seemed to fail her. She turned sharply, heels clicking in retreat, but her control was already slipping. And David knew, as he picked up his coffee again and watched her storm away, that this was only the beginning of a much larger battle, one that would test not just his patience, but his dignity, his right to belong, and the strength of an entire community to see through prejudice disguised as rules. And as the sun rose higher over Maplewood, the stage was set. The battle lines had been drawn. The folded notice still rested on David Johnson's kitchen counter, a sharp reminder of how quickly dreams could sour. He had placed it there deliberately, not in anger but in clarity, as if the piece of paper was Exhibit A in a case that was just beginning. By Monday morning, He thought perhaps the storm would pass. Neighbors would return to their routines. Margaret would find another target, and he would be left to unpack in peace. But prejudice rarely retreats quietly, and Margaret Whitmore had never been known to let go. When David stepped outside that morning with his second cup of coffee, he noticed it immediately. Not one, but 3 brightly colored notices fluttering on his porch railing. One accused him of improper trash can placement, another of failing to register with the HOA office, and the last Margaret's boldest move, yet warned of immediate legal action if proof of residency wasn't provided within 48 hours. David picked them up slowly, his hand tightening around the papers. It was absurd, almost comical, and yet beneath the comedy lay something darker. This wasn't about trash cans or porch boxes. It was about the audacity of his presence, about being a black man in a neighborhood that someone like Margaret had decided was not his to claim. Across the street, as if summoned by the tension, Margaret appeared. Her posture was perfect, her clipboard tucked neatly under her arm, her sunglasses reflecting David's frustration back at him. She didn't speak immediately. She waited, as though silence could sharpen the knife. Finally, her voice cut through the morning air. "You can keep pulling them down," she called, "but they'll keep coming back until you comply." Neighbors began to emerge, drawn not by sympathy but by curiosity. A man with a dog lingered by the mailbox longer than necessary. Curtains twitched open in 3 separate houses. Even the mail carrier slowed his steps as he approached the corner. Maplewood had become a stage, and Margaret knew her audience. David took a breath, steady but firm. He walked to the edge of his lawn, the stack of notices in his hand, and looked Margaret straight in the eye. "You want to talk about this?" he said, his voice calm but amplified by conviction. "Then let's actually talk." The crowd stiffened, as though sensing that the morning had turned into something more than neighborly chatter. Margaret crossed the street with that sharp stride of hers, heels striking against the pavement like a drumbeat of control. When she stopped just a few feet away, her words carried enough venom to sting. "You're refusing to cooperate," she announced loudly, ensuring that every ear nearby could catch the accusation. David held up the notices. "I'm refusing to be harassed," he countered. "This isn't harassment," Margaret shot back. "This is enforcement." A humorless laugh escaped David, not out of amusement but disbelief. "Enforcement? For boxes on a porch? For a trash can angled wrong? Come on. This isn't about rules. This is about you not wanting me here." The words struck like a match in dry grass. Some neighbors shifted uncomfortably. Others pretended to look away but stayed close enough to listen. Everyone heard the undertone. David had named what many suspected but few dared to say. Margaret leaned forward, lowering her voice but sharpening the blade. "If you really owned this house, you'd have nothing to hide. But everything about you screams tenant, and tenants lower property values." It wasn't just the words. It was the way she lingered on you, as though it carried the weight of more than just doubt. A ripple of silence followed. People understood what she meant, even if she never said it outright. She didn't need to say it. David folded the notices neatly, his movements deliberate, his composure intact. "You're overstepping," he said firmly. "I don't owe you explanations. Not here. Not on my lawn. If you have questions about ownership, check the county records." Margaret's lips curled. "I don't need county records. I need proof from you." "Then you're going to be waiting a long time," David replied, "because I don't answer to you." Her voice rose, sharp enough to cut through the morning. "This is my neighborhood. I've kept it in order for over a decade. People respect me because I make sure things are done right. If you think you can waltz in here and ignore the system, you're mistaken." David stepped closer, closing the gap not with aggression but with undeniable presence. His voice was calm, but each word landed with weight. "Respect isn't something you demand, it's something you earn," the crowd murmured. It was subtle, but it was there a shifting tide, a recognition that authority built on fear could be challenged by truth. For a brief moment, Margaret faltered. Her grip on the clipboard wavered, but pride pushed her forward. She turned to the audience, gesturing dramatically. "You all know what happens when rules are ignored. One person pushes the boundaries, and suddenly the whole community suffers. Is that what we want?" A few heads nodded out of habit, but most remained silent. Silence, however, was no longer her ally. David didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "I bought this house because I wanted peace, a place where I could build a future without interference. But instead, I've had to waste my time defending myself against someone who doesn't even know my name." The line landed heavier than Margaret expected. She flushed, realizing the sting of truth had cut deeper than she intended. Neighbors exchanged glances, some nodding quietly in David's direction. "You'll regret talking to me like that," Margaret hissed. "No," David said, his voice measured but firm. "The only regret here is that you've mistaken intimidation for leadership." The silence that followed was deafening. For once, Margaret had no immediate retort. She turned abruptly, storming back across the street. Clipboard clutched like a shield, her heels clicking unevenly now, not a march of power, but a retreat. David stood there, the notices still in his hand, the eyes of the neighborhood still on him. He knew Margaret wouldn't stop. People like her rarely did. But he also knew something had shifted. The audience that once whispered behind curtains was now forced to see the truth in daylight. He exhaled slowly, not in relief but in preparation. Because this was only the first strike, and in battles like these, the opening blow was never the last. The stage was set for something bigger, a confrontation not just about boxes or trash cans, but about dignity, equality, and who truly had the right to call Maplewood home. And as David stepped back onto his porch, setting the notices down beside his coffee, he whispered to himself words that would carry him through the days ahead. "They can question my presence, but they cannot erase my right to be here." The fight was only beginning. The next confrontation didn't take long to arrive. By Wednesday morning, Maplewood Lane had already settled into its peculiar rhythm. Joggers moving past with earbuds in, dogs tugging their owners toward trees, sprinklers ticking across manicured lawns. Yet beneath the surface, the street hummed with quiet anticipation. Everyone knew the tension between David Johnson and Margaret Whitmore had not reached its peak. People were waiting, some with sympathy, others with curiosity, and still others with the quiet thrill of drama unfolding in their own backyard. David stepped outside with a box under his arm, ready to haul it to the curb. Inside were family keepsakes he hadn't decided where to place yet. An old football helmet from high school, medals from a 10 Kelvins he once ran, and a leather-bound journal where he'd recorded his thoughts during college. The years when he'd been told more than once that he didn't belong in certain classrooms. He breathed deeply, trying to center himself. He wanted this house to be different, but he could already sense the eyes waiting for him. Margaret didn't disappoint. She appeared at the edge of the street like a storm cloud rolling in on cue, heels sharp, clipboard tucked beneath her arm. This time, she didn't bother with pleasantries. "Mr. Johnson," she called loudly, "you have 48 hours left to present proof of ownership. Failure to do so will result in fines." Her voice carried, intentionally loud enough for those watering lawns or checking mailboxes to hear. A woman with a stroller slowed, pretending to adjust the blanket. A teenager with a basketball paused his dribble, hovering near his driveway. Margaret had crafted her stage, and David was once again cast as the unwilling actor. He set the box down gently, straightened his shoulders, and looked at her. "I told you already," he said calmly. "This is my home. I paid for it in full. You don't need proof from me. You can check the county records yourself." Margaret's lips curled, and her sunglasses glinted. "Records can be manipulated. Documents can be forged. What we can't afford here is instability." She took a step closer, her words sharpening. "Tenants don't maintain property values. We need stability, not temporary people." The word hung in the air. Temporary people. It wasn't subtle. The crowd felt it. Some looked away, embarrassed at hearing prejudice so plainly spoken, but no one interrupted. David's patience cracked, not with shouting but with resolve. He raised his voice just enough to cut through the murmurs. "Let me make something clear. I am not temporary. I am not a guest here. I belong in this neighborhood just as much as you or anyone else. And if you think otherwise, then maybe the problem isn't me, maybe it's you." The teenager's basketball slipped from his hands and rolled into the street. The woman with the stroller bit her lip, whispering something to herself. Even the dog walkers slowed, sensing history being made in real time. Margaret's face flushed crimson, her authority being chipped away by the calm defiance of the man she had tried to shame. She leaned in closer, whispering now, though the venom was clear. "You'll regret standing against me." David didn't flinch. He leaned slightly forward, his voice steady but loud enough for those around to hear. "No, Margaret. The only regret here will be yours when you realize that intimidation is not leadership and prejudice is not power." Hem. The silence afterward felt like thunder. Neighbors glanced at each other, some nodding quietly, others shifting uncomfortably. For the first time, the story wasn't about David being on trial. It was about Margaret's authority beginning to fracture. And as she turned on her heel and stormed away, David felt the weight of history in his chest. This wasn't just his battle anymore. The whole neighborhood had been forced to see the truth. 2 days later, Margaret escalated. She wasn't content with notices or public humiliation. She needed evidence, something to tighten her grip and prove that David didn't belong. So, on a humid Friday afternoon, she marched up his driveway with 2 HOA committee members in tow. One carried a phone, already recording. Margaret's clipboard snapped open like a weapon. David was kneeling by flower pots, adjusting soil, trying to breathe through the exhaustion of constant confrontation. He looked up and froze. Margaret's heels crunched against the gravel, her stride unrelenting. "You're trespassing," David said firmly, brushing dirt from his gloves. "I'm documenting," Margaret snapped. "Failure to comply leaves me no choice but to escalate." She raised her phone, snapping pictures of the porch, the lawn, even a hairline crack in the sidewalk. David stood, his height towering over her attempt at intimidation. "Document all you want, but if you don't leave, I'll call the police." Margaret smirked. "Go ahead. I'll explain to them you're refusing to provide proof of ownership. Then we'll see who they believe." The words carried a chilling undertone. It wasn't just about property anymore. It was about power, the kind that came when a white woman believed law enforcement would side with her word over a black man's truth. Neighbors slowed their walks. Children on bikes stopped at the corner, wide-eyed. Even the mail carrier lingered a few steps back, sensing the weight of what was unfolding. David reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded document he had been carrying for days, just in case. He unfolded it slowly, deliberately, and held it high. "You want proof?" His voice carried steady across the street. "Here at Island." The deed shimmered in the afternoon light, stamped and signed by the Franklin County Recorder's Office. Bold lettering declared, "David L. Johnson, owner of record." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Even the children paused their bikes. The mail carrier adjusted his cap and nodded quietly. "This house belongs to me," David said firmly. "I purchased it outright. No lease, no landlord, no temporary anything. I am the homeowner." Margaret blinked, her face pale beneath the afternoon sunday. She scoffed weakly. "Anyone could print something like that." David raised an eyebrow. "You think the county recorder's seal is something you can print at home? Check the public records yourself. They're open to anyone." The mail carrier, emboldened, nodded again. "He's right. You can check that online in minutes." Margaret's grip on her clipboard tightened. Her authority wavered. She glanced around at the neighbors, desperate for support, but the silence was louder than any cheer. "Ownership doesn't excuse non-compliance," she spat finally. "Rules are rules." David folded the deed neatly, tucking it back into his pocket. "And harassment isn't leadership. Maybe you've forgotten the difference." The crowd murmured, some clapping softly, others whispering. For the first time, Margaret's power cracked in full view. Saturday morning dawned heavy with humidity, the kind that made shirts cling and tempers quicker to flare. David had decided to spend it arranging furniture in his living room, hoping for at least one day free of conflict. But conflict has a way of finding those who refuse to bow, and Margaret wasn't ready to surrender. She came across the street with renewed fire in her eyes, her clipboard hugged tightly to her chest like a shield, and 2 neighbors trailing reluctantly behind her, unwilling accomplices to her show of power. David noticed the trio approaching and sighed, setting down a framed photo of his grandmother on the mantel. He stepped outside, closing the door behind him, and met Margaret halfway down the driveway. "Morning," he said evenly, his voice steady. Margaret didn't respond. Instead, she slapped another violation notice against her clipboard. "Mr. Johnson," she declared loudly, "until you provide direct documentation to this board, your property remains under review." David shook his head. "You already saw the deed yesterday. Half the street saw it. That wasn't enough?" "Not until it's filed with this office," she said sharply, tapping her clipboard as if it were an official seal. "Rules must be respected." Behind her, one of the neighbors, an older man named Howard Briggs, shifted uncomfortably. He had lived on Maplewood for 30 years, long enough to remember when Margaret first started her reign. He murmured, "Margaret, maybe let it go. The deed looked real to me." Margaret snapped her head toward him. "Howard, please." You of all people should understand what's at stake. If we don't enforce rules, what happens next? Loud music? Parties? Property values plummeting? The undertone wasn't subtle. To Margaret, David was a harbinger of decline, a stereotype she wielded like a weapon. David, holding back the weight of his frustration, reached calmly into his pocket. Once again, he unfolded the deed, this time with deliberate patience. He raised it high enough for everyone to see. This is the Franklin County deed, stamped, sealed, signed. I am the owner of this home. No lease, no landlord, just me. And you know what the best part is? He stepped closer, his voice lowering but carrying strength. I don't need your permission to live in my own house. The words echoed across the lawns. A few neighbors clapped lightly, hesitant at first, but growing louder. A woman across the street, Linda Perez, a young mother who had been quietly supportive, whispered to another neighbor, "He's right. This is harassment." Margaret's face twisted, pride warring with panic. "Ownership doesn't mean you can ignore standards," she hissed. David tucked the deed back into his pocket and looked her squarely in the eye. "And authority doesn't mean you can target someone because of who they are." The crowd's murmurs rose again. Howard crossed his arms, nodding faintly. For the first time, Margaret's grip on the community was slipping visibly. She turned abruptly, muttering, "This isn't over." But even as she stormed away, the neighbor's eyes stayed fixed on David, not on her. And in that shift, power had begun to change hands. David exhaled slowly, glancing down at the picture of his grandmother through the living room window. He thought of her words, "Respect isn't given by titles, it's earned by truth." He smiled faintly, knowing she would have been proud. But he also knew Margaret wasn't finished, and the next move she made would drag the entire street into the storm. The following week, Maplewood transformed into something like a courtroom without walls. Every driveway, every mailbox run, every whispered exchange on the sidewalk became a jury deliberating between two stories, Margaret's warnings of chaos and David's quiet insistence on dignity. At first, the division was subtle. Tom Harris, an older resident who had always supported Margaret, muttered at barbecues that David was trouble waiting to happen. But others, like Linda Perez, began offering small gestures, a friendly wave, a kind word. One morning, she approached David while pushing her toddler in a stroller. "I just want you to know," she said softly, "not all of us think the way she does. Some of us are glad you're here. The place looks better already." David smiled warmly. "Thank you. That means more than you know." But prejudice doesn't dissolve with kindness alone. Margaret organized impromptu sidewalk meetings outside her home, clipboards and papers spread across a folding table. She ranted about community standards, her voice rising so neighbors couldn't avoid hearing. "He's reckless," she barked. "No respect for process. If he stays unchecked, who knows what comes next? Loud parties, cars on the lawn, God knows what else." Howard, standing reluctantly nearby, frowned. His wife Eleanor whispered, "Maybe she's gone too far." But Howard kept silent, still afraid to challenge the woman who had dominated Maplewood for decades. Meanwhile, David carried groceries from his car one afternoon when he noticed Eleanor lingering at the curb. "Can I help you?" he asked kindly. She hesitated before leaning closer. "Just be patient," she said. "People are watching. They'll see the truth for themselves." David nodded slowly. "Silence isn't neutral," he replied. "It's agreement, but thank you." The divide deepened. Children who once waved at Margaret crossed the street instead. Longtime residents who had once greeted her with cheer now offered only curt nods. The cracks in her support base were showing. But Margaret refused to let go. And in her desperation, she dug into county records and discovered a twist she believed would restore her control. Margaret sat at her kitchen table late into the night, maps and surveys spread across the surface. Her manicured nails tapped impatiently until she found what she was looking for. A red boundary line shifted by less than 6 feet. According to the latest survey, part of her beloved backyard, the one where she hosted HOA barbecues, wasn't hers at all. It belonged to David Johnson. Her heart raced, not with panic, but with excitement. She saw leverage. She saw a weapon. The next evening, she stormed across the street, packet in hand. David was kneeling in his backyard, tending to a flower bed, when she appeared at the fence line like a storm cloud. "Care to explain this?" she demanded, slapping the papers against the wood. David rose slowly, dusting soil from his hands. Explain what? This, she snapped. According to these records, part of this yard isn't yours. It's mine. That fence of yours is illegal. David took the packet calmly, scanning the highlighted sections. Then he nodded. Yes, I know about the survey adjustment. My realtor mentioned it during closing. Margaret's mouth fell open. You knew? Of course, David replied evenly. That strip belongs to me now. The deed reflects the correction. Neighbors gasped. Whispers spread like wildfire. Margaret's face drained of color. That's absurd. I've maintained that yard for years. Everyone knows it's mine. David folded the documents neatly and handed them back. I didn't claim it. The county survey did. If you have an issue, take it up with them, not me. Her jaw tightened, rage spilling into her voice. You think you can take part of my property and parade it like a trophy? David stepped closer, lowering his voice but ensuring the neighbors heard. No, Margaret. I think you built your kingdom on ground that doesn't belong to you. The crowd murmured louder. Even Howard finally spoke up. He's right. If the county says it's his, it's his. That's the law. Margaret spun toward him, eyes blazing. You're siding with him? I'm siding with facts, Howard replied simply. And with that, Margaret's power cracked again. Desperation drives boldness. Margaret called an emergency HOA meeting, stuffing mailboxes with flyers marked mandatory attendance, though everyone knew it wasn't legally required. Still, curiosity was strong, and by Thursday evening, the community center buzzed with neighbors filling folding chairs, whispering in anticipation. Margaret stood at the podium in her sharpest blazer, hair pulled tight, clipboard perched like a gavel. Since day one, she began, I've worked tirelessly to protect our community. But now we face someone who refuses to follow the rules, someone who undermines everything we've built. He claims ownership of land that has been part of my home for decades. If we allow this, what comes next? Disorder, decline. Gasps mixed with skeptical chuckles. Her words didn't land as smoothly as before. David rose slowly, his presence calm but commanding. Let's be clear, he said. I am not a tenant. I purchased my home outright. The deed is in my name, filed with Franklin County. And yes, the survey changed. Yes, part of Margaret's backyard now belongs to me. That wasn't my doing. That was the county's correction. I have no intention of tearing down fences or making this ugly. But I will not be treated like I don't belong. His words resonated. The room murmured with agreement. Howard stood, voice firm. I looked at the survey myself. The county made the adjustment. It's not up for debate. Frankly, this feels personal. A heavy silence fell. Margaret's eyes widened, then narrowed. Personal? She spat. Yes, Howard said. From the moment he arrived, you assumed the worst. You went after him with notices, threats, and gossip. That's not leadership. That's harassment. The crowd erupted with murmurs, some clapping, some whispering fiercely. Margaret slammed her clipboard down. I will not be disrespected. I've given years of service to this community. David didn't raise his voice. Respect isn't built on control. It's built on fairness. The room thundered with applause. Within minutes, slips of paper were passed out. Neighbors scribbled their votes, folded them, and dropped them into a box at the front. The air felt electric, decades of tension boiling down to this moment. The results were read aloud. Confidence in current HOA President 9. No confidence 27. Gasps, then applause. Margaret's knuckles whitened as she gripped the podium. This is a mistake, she stammered. Without me, this place will fall apart. But the crowd wasn't listening. They had already turned toward David, shaking his hand, clapping his shoulder. Even those who had once doubted him now saw clearly. David raised his voice just enough to carry. What falls apart is control built on fear. What stands is respect built on truth. The words sealed the night. Margaret stormed out, her heels clattering, but the sound no longer carried power. The morning after the vote, Maplewood felt lighter. Neighbors waved again. Children played freely. The air no longer carried the weight of silent judgment. David stepped onto his porch, sipping his coffee, and finally felt the peace he had dreamed of. A knock at the gate drew his attention. It was Margaret. She looked older, stripped of her armor, hands clasped tightly. I overstepped, she said quietly. I thought being president meant control, but all I did was push people away. I'm sorry for how I treated you. David studied her carefully, then nodded. Apology accepted. But it's not just me you owe. It's this neighborhood. She glanced at the houses around them, where curtains twitched and neighbors watched. She gave a stiff nod. I'll try. And, for the first time, David saw not the tyrant of the HOA, but a woman wrestling with her own pride. He softened. Leadership isn't about proving you're right. It's about listening, about protecting, not policing. Her husband Richard appeared on the porch behind her, relief in his eyes. The neighbors, too, seemed to exhale collectively. The storm had passed. That evening, David sat on his porch as children played tag under the streetlights. Linda Perez joined him with her stroller, smiling. "You didn't just stand up for yourself," she said. "You stood up for all of us." David chuckled softly. "I didn't move here planning to fight. I just wanted peace. But maybe sometimes peace has to be earned." He leaned back, watching the laughter of children, the warmth of community restored. And he knew respect wasn't just written in deeds or surveys. It was forged in how people treated one another. He whispered to himself, raising his glass of iced tea, "Justice always finds a way." And for the first time since moving in, David Johnson truly felt at home.